Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of our speaker series, Identity and Belonging in a Global Age, sponsored by the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and the Center on Modernity and Transition. I'm Benjamin Schewel, Senior Fellow at the Kenan Institute and co-director of the Center on Modernity and Transition.
And I'm Shahrzad Sabet. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. And together with Ben, I direct the Center on Modernity and Transition. Questions of collective identity and belonging have surged to prominence in recent years. This speaker series brings together leading thinkers to examine the crises of identity that confront us in a rapidly changing global age, and to think deeply together about how humanity might solve them. Today, we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Akeel Bilgrami and Cornel West to discuss identity, spirituality, and social change.
Akeel Bilgrami is Sidney Morgenbesser Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University. He's the author of Self-Knowledge and Resentment, Secularism, Identity, and Enchantment, and a forthcoming book from Columbia University Press on Gandhi's philosophy. Cornel West is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice at Union Theological Seminary and Professor Emeritus at Princeton University. His books include Race Matters, Democracy Matters, and Black Prophetic Fire. Cornel, Akeel, a very warm welcome to you both.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me just first salute both of you for being such forces of good in the life of the mind, the work that you've done. The history of religions playing a very important role, Brother Ben, and that reimagined universalism and ways of wrestling with cosmopolitanism and the work of our dear sister Shahrzad. And Brother Akeel, I don't have the language to describe him. I'm telling you, what a towering philosophical figure in our time. Anytime I get a chance to be in conversation with him, it could be with Brother John T. at Union, or course on King and Gandhi, where he visits regularly and just blows the mind of the students, getting them to rethink Gandhi in very deep and profound ways, or be it there at Columbia, having such magnificent impact on the blessed students there.
Cornel, it's so great to see you. So great to see you, Cornel. It's boosted my morale the moment that John Tattermill told me you moved back to New York. I said, forget about COVID. I'm a happy man again. What the hell were you doing? What the hell were you doing wandering around in Boston all those years? You silly man.
Oh, just lost in translation, brother. Lost in translation.
Great to have you back. Great to have you.
Well, welcome again, and thank you for your kind words, Cornel. It's a real a pleasure and an honor for us to be in conversation with both of you. As our audience knows, we like to begin these conversations on a personal and biographical note. So to start us off, I want to ask each of you to tell us a little bit about some of the more personal pathways that have led you to think about and write about the themes of our discussion today, namely identity, spirituality, and social change. Akeel, perhaps we could begin with you.
Okay, I just want to say first that it's a big thrill for me to be with somebody who's been a hero of mine ever since I've first read him, and have been inspired by his work and his activism all these years, and so it's a great thrill for me to talk with him. You know, Shahrzad, I have to say that I was very involved in politics when I was a kid in Bombay in college, in left politics. And then for many years after I went to Oxford, I came back and went back to India and did some teaching and some political work. And then I came to America and I got completely focused on very arcane, interesting, but rather remote areas of philosophy, of language, philosophy of mind, and so on. And then it's interesting, the question you posed. You know, one day I got a call from PBS It was on February 14th, 1989. And they said, would you come to our studio, Channel 13, because a fatwa has been declared against Salman Rushdie, and we want some comments from somebody. And apparently they had asked Edward Said first. And Edward Said had told them that he didn't know enough about it to comment, but there was this guy who went to school with Salman Rushdie in Bombay many years ago, and he has been completely apolitical for many years, and it would be great if you asked him and draw him out on these issues. So it was Edward's manipulative, benign manipulativeness that got me back into thinking about these subjects that you're asking about. And in fact, that night after that interview, I wrote a piece called "What is a Muslim?" It was pretty much written all in several hours that night and the next day. And ever since then, I've been thinking about that subject.
Thank you, Akeel. What an interesting story. Cornel?
Well, I'm just so glad that Brother Edward Said has had that kind of personal impact on my dear brother, because well, since '89, it's just that wisdom and philosophy has been flowing in terms of engaging ways in which social change can play a role in how we conceive of philosophy, and how philosophy can play a role in how we conceive of social change. But for me, it's three basic pillars: it's vocation, tradition, and revolution. And it's been fairly consistent and constant throughout my whole life, growing up on the chocolate side of Sacramento, deeply rooted in the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem given the Black church, falling in love with the Socratic legacy of Athens when I had access to it, both reading and then studying, at Harvard under Hilary Putnam and Stanley Cavell and John Rawls and others, and then with Sheldon Wolin and Richard Rorty and Tom Scallon and Tom Nagel at Princeton, where the sense of a calling in the life of the mind, taking seriously traditional conceptions of quest for truth and goodness and beauty, and then realizing ways in which they're inadequate but indispensable. And then Gadamer, I spent a whole year with the great Hans Georg Gadamer. He's still somebody who speaks very deeply to me, where he would always say traditions are inescapable and unavoidable. The question is not whether you're shaped by tradition, but which ones, and how do you situate and locate yourself within the tradition. That's some truth and method that meant and continues to mean much for me. And so my tradition is one of deep resistance and critique. And revolution that I learned really at Black Panther Party. I've never a member because they didn't accept Christians, but that was all right. We had deep overlap. And I learned much from them in terms of the centrality of class analysis and anti-imperialist views of the world, not just in one country or one hemisphere, but in a global way. So you got a built-in internationalism and universalism there that resonated with my Christian sensibility. But I also realized that, that revolution is not some kind of crude and coarse affair, but it has to do with how you see the world, the lens through which you see, how deeply you feel in terms of the depth of your compassion and love and willingness to serve and sacrifice. And then the courage, just the courage to act, so that intellectual courage, moral courage, political courage becomes part and parcel of one's vocation. And so, 68 years old now, I'm the same brother I was at almost 50 years ago. It's just that I've read more and try to be a bit more wise and much more prepared to die now than I was then, I think.
Thanks very much for sharing your story and your approach to these questions. So in terms of this speaker series, one of the premises that sort of undergirds all of the conversations is this conviction that humanity faces a crisis of identity and belonging today. And one of the striking dimensions of this crisis is a palpable tension between universal and particular identities, between our oneness and diversity as human beings. And so we see often universalist appeals to our shared humanity. they can and often have silence or obscure the distinctive experiences of oppression, of exploitation, or just the histories and distinctive characteristics of diverse peoples. And in fact, what we see is that some of our most cherished universal ideals, whether from the Enlightenment or from religious traditions or democratic traditions, have contributed to a kind of blanket commensuration of different human beings. It blurs and distorts our divergent realities, which constitute the human experience. But at the same time, we can see how a retraction of the universal dimension of human identity can lead to a sense that there's no commensurability between human beings, that the reality of one person and another is so divergent and fragmented that there's no way for them to have this true sense of solidarity and community and oneness. So at the same time, essentializing the boundaries that separate from one another, they can lead us to vilify those who disagree with us, to aspire to ideological purity rather than broad-based consensus and solidarity. So these are also some of the pervasive expressions of the tension between universal and particular identities that we see today. So how in this moment of crisis do each of you see that we can begin as intellectuals, as citizens, as members of a national and global public, how do we begin to resolve these tensions? So Cornel, we can perhaps begin with you.
I mean, one thing is to try to historically situate our particular challenge, but then always understand that we're talking about perennial issues. As long as there have been human beings around, there's always been the expression of a desire for protection, desire for association, and a desire for recognition, desire in the face of physical death, kind of eros thanatos dynamic. And that's human identity. I mean, that's what identity is. And the question becomes, what are the iterations? What are the incarnations and exemplifications of these desires for protection, for association, and for recognition? You know, what Edmund Burke called the small platoons, shaped in family, civic associations, nation states. All of these can become sources of identity, race, gender, sexual orientation. All of these are iterations of something that has been at work ever since we emerged from the caves. And so the question is, okay, under modern conditions or late modern or postmodern conditions, how do we understand these iterations and try to always keep track of what is the moral content of these identities and what are the political consequences of these identities, so that moral and spiritual lens remain the fundamental way of seeing these various iterations of different kinds of identities. And in the modern world, the most powerful identity is probably nationalism. And I know the brother Akeel is written and so grounded in the great Tagore Gandhi exchange, the correspondence. It's one of the great examples of how you come to terms with internationalism and nationalism. How do you come to terms with cultural and social pluralism and deeper attempts to hold on to common humanity? All of those complex issues at work in that correspondence. And for me, that's one of the great moments of wrestling with these kinds of issues. In my own context, it was Black Panther Party versus cultural nationalists. It was Frantz Fanon versus early Amiri Baraka, where you had a certain kind of Black nationalism, highly suspicious of any outsiders, highly suspicious of any white supremacist formulations of the world, and therefore fell back on a Blackness, capital B. It wasn't just a real Black, it was capital B Blackness that had been so despised and debased and devalued and so forth. And we understood how it had been debased and what have you. But with Fanon and others, it was a national consciousness, not a nationalism, that was always on the way toward a new humanism, on the way toward an internationalism, on the way to what Sister Shahrzad would call a reimagined universalism. So it was grounded in the thickness of lived experience, ROOTS, but the ROUTES, to use the language of our dear brother Paul Gilroy, always allowed us to have solidarity but other folk who are wrestling with these issues in their own context. So that's how I tend to have to orient myself. That's why I'm very suspicious of any of these neoliberal conceptions of identity politics that just weaponize race and gender to make the empire more colorful and make predatory capitalist processes more diverse. And yet the class structures and the structures of domination remain untouched.
Akeel, what would you add to Cornel's?
Yeah, I completely agree with Cornel, and you know, one of the ways in which it's such a hard issue, but when there's so many different identity claims coming from difference, coming from hatred, and so on. One of the things that I've tried to understand, Cornel and Benjamin, is you know, when I was growing up and I was very much part of the left movement in India, we really thought that these many other identities were sort of parochializing the real issue, which is class identity. They were distracting from the real issue by parochializing, you know, by other forms of identity. And
Right.
and I think that view is certainly one that I've no longer hold. But here's just a suggestion, Cornel, which I wanted you to consider and comment on, which is maybe one way we could ask the question, which of these many different identities that have surfaced over the last many decades is more fundamental? If you ask the question, which is more fundamental at any given context or any given time, one way of trying to answer that question is to ask the following counterfactual question, which is, so let's take gender identity. So many gains, not by any means complete, not by any means even very substantial, but some gains have been made on the gender front.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? There's been legislation. It was all through the last century. Slowly, there were some gains made, and most of all in the 70s and 80s, some gains were made. Now, suppose we ask the counterfactual question: if these gains, such as they are, had undermined capital, if they had undermined the corporate stranglehold on our societies, would they have been allowed? You see, if you ask that counterfactual question, suppose the gains on the race front, suppose the gains on the gender front, suppose the gains on the caste front in India.
Right.
These are all forms of identity, gender, caste. If the gains, such as they are, non-negligible, but not by any means complete, but non-negligible, would they have been allowed, these gains, if they had undermined capital in any serious way? And if you feel the answer is no, then in some sense, in a sober sense, not in the bad sense of that I was admitting to earlier on, right? But in some sense, you show why you can't leave class out, right? That it is a shaping and determining thing.
That's right.
Right? That if such gains have been made, would they have been allowed if they'd undermined capital? And if your answer is no, then there's some sense in which class identity is an indispensable identity. That's a thought of mine. That, and you can ask another question. Can you say, have the gains in the class front, would they have been allowed if they undermined patriarchy, or if they undermined, white supremacy, or whatever it might be? You can put different counterfactual questions, but it's a way of asking in which context, which is more fundamental and so on. But that's an initial thought of mine. When it comes to this
I like that very much, though. I think those kind of hypothetical, counterfactual questions help us sharpen what's at stake when we're talking about these issues. But for me, you see, I think it's very important. You tell me what you think, my dear brother. And this is true for our dear sister and brother who are asking questions. I told them their voices are very important here. They've got corpuses that are highly substantive and crucial. But I would put it this way, though. You see that the class identity is only cultural in the context of class organization, trade union movements. You see, in the United States, you had a dictatorship of capital, so that workers didn't even have the right to engage in substantive collective bargaining until 1936. So you have a settler colonial experiment that has democratic elements to it that already have deeply reinforced race, because you got indigenous peoples and you got African slaves as the very pillar of your project, even as the workers are coming from Europe, different genders, and Catholics and Jews and so forth. See? But class identity, like Lukács is calling for in History and Class Consciousness, right? That if it's not grounded in some culture of, some structure of feeling that reinforces class identity, even given the centrality of class analysis, which I still accept, and I think you still accept in terms of it being an indispensable factor, not the only, but indispensable, it can't take on any cultural content because you don't have a culture of working class people. In Britain, it's very different because Britain had to fight as working people to even gain the right to vote. That's not true in the United States. So that you have different trajectories in this regard. But see, for me, let's say briefly, that I mean, my cultural identity as a Black man cuts from head to toe, because that's my lived experience. You know what I mean? I'm dreaming Curtis Mayfield. I'm singing Coltrane and he don't even have no lyrics in his song. So, I mean, that's who I am. But that's not my moral identity. No, my Christian identity cuts deeper than that. The legacy of Jerusalem cuts deeper than that, right? My intellectual identity is as hybrid as could be. Chekhov means as much as Coltrane. So, and some others too. So that my political identity becomes then one of an analytical lens in which empire and predatory capitalism with its class conflicts and corporate domination and Wall Street and Pentagon with the military extension of the empire and so forth, the sensitivity to precious trans and non-binaries and gays and lesbians and so forth. These are different registers all in the same person.
Yes.
So that, you know, Brother Jameson used to always remind us, you historicize, you contextualize, you pluralize. So the question is, we all got these plural identities of different registers and different dimensions. But then the question becomes, what kind of human beings are we going to do with these composite identities? You see what I mean? And that becomes, I think, a difficult one because, you know, in late modernity, this is where I think Nietzsche is absolutely right, that it's very much a struggle with nihilism. It's the hopelessness, the meaninglessness, the lovelessness, the touchlessness, given atomistic effects of a predatory capitalist world, highly commodified world. The need to connect. People want to make some kind of need protection, association, and recognition given these processes that are at work. And they deserve, everybody ought to have some love and touch and meaning and so forth and so on. But it's so hard to gain access to it, whether religious, non-religious, or what have you. So that's another layer that needs to be taken into consideration. But you see the point that I'm trying to get at?
Yes.
All three of them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, in fact, if you look at the fact that that religion, the decline, you know, I went to a church in Paris. I like going to churches because it's so peaceful. You know, it really, I spent just half an hour sitting in a church quietly, just changes my mood for the whole week in a way. So I went to a church on a Sunday in Paris, a large church, and there were only 3 people there. This was, wow, you know, about I think it was in the about 15, 20 years ago. Now, and this is true generally of Europe, of European countries, Western European countries. And I think that it's changing now, but for about 100 years, from the late 19th century to around a century, for a whole century, before neoliberalism completely, destroyed unions, as you pointed out, the affective cultural community element that you were talking about was there for class in Europe, because there were people would just go to union meetings 3 times a week.
Absolutely.
And it's no wonder that people stopped going to church, at least working people. Just they had an alternative for almost 100 years. All that is fading now, of course, since the unions have been destroyed in Western capitalist societies. But that was a real thing. And of course, unions have been much weaker here. They've had much less, so the church remains very strong here. And the church can be very reactionary, but nevertheless does provide the kind of affective and community element here. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Cornel, did you want to jump in, or this exchange kind of leads into our next question? So maybe we can go there and then pick it up.
That sounds good. That sounds good to me.
Great. So Akeel, you've written, as was mentioned, extensively, both about questions of identity and about the philosophy of Mohandas Gandhi. So I want to ask you to bring these themes together for us and to reflect on the conception of collective identity that we might derive from Gandhi's thought and writing. In several of your own works, you articulate what you understand to be the Gandhian ideal of a socially unalienated life. You write, "What we aspire to when we seek a socially unalienated life with one another is the realization of the ideal that nobody in society is well off if someone is badly off." Now, you're very quick to clarify that this ideal is not only different from the modern liberal ideal of equality, but it's also qualitatively different from conventional notions of empathy or fraternity or care. It assumes, in a sense, a different social ontology in which I suffer and I experience real malaise when another in society is not well off. I'll leave it to you to elaborate the notion further, but given what appears to be this increasing inability of our traditional group identities to satisfy the human yearnings for belonging and for agency, I wonder if the condition of deep connectedness, and one might say spiritual interdependence, entailed in this ideal of an unalienated life might inform a reconceptualization of collective identity. Admittedly, a radical one, but a reconceptualization of collective identity that is, let's say, better suited to this age of pervasive malaise and discontent. Akeel?
Yeah. See, Shahrzad, it's a very interesting question. I think that what prompted me to explore this is that I noticed that both Marx and Gandhi never put liberty and equality, the great ideals of the Enlightenment, of modernity, they never put them on center stage. In fact, Marx dismissed liberty and equality as bourgeois ideals. And Gandhi is totally indifferent to, he doesn't talk much about liberty and equality. So I tried to explore why that should be so, because we were all brought up on liberty and equality as absolutely central ideals in our education, in our political lives growing up. And I came to the conclusion, studying both Marx and Gandhi, that what they thought was that it's a very strange thing that in the European Enlightenment, and it spread through colonialism, these two great ideals were as soon as they were articulated, they were put into tension with one another. And both Marx and Gandhi found this very perverse. That is, you articulate two great ideals and then you immediately theorize them in such a way that they are in irresolvable tension with one another. Right? I mean, the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States, just one relatively shallow, spectacular manifestation of that tension between claims for liberty and claims for equality, right? But it's there in all theorizing, and in fact in societies. Every time you increase equality, it seems that you're undermining liberty, and vice versa. Just the way things went in behind the Iron Curtain, and then over here you increase. So in Marx and Gandhi, I found a way of trying to reconfigure the very concepts of liberty and equality so that they're not in tension with one another by nesting them in a more fundamental ideal for both Marx and Gandhi, which is the ideal of an unalienated life, an ideal of a social life without alienation. And if liberty and equality were not on center stage by themselves, but were part of this much larger claim, and unalienatedness, as Cornel was saying, can come from traditional sources, religious sources, spiritual sources. It's got a very large and actually much more long-standing. Liberty and equality only came with the Enlightenment, but the idea of belonging, of being unalienated, is a much older ideal and much more traditional, and it's there in folk and spiritual traditions and so on. So if you could situate liberty and equality within this ideal, which would be on center stage, more fundamental, then liberty and equality would not be, their achievement would not be an achievement of a kind of social engineering as it is in modern capitalist societies, but it would be a deeper thing. That was my way of reading Gandhi and Marx, that Gandhi and Marx were after this, and that's why they didn't stress liberty and equality as much.
Mm-hmm.
Cornel,
Right.
I was going to say, I have a question. We can come back to the question of identity in just a moment, but yeah, I'd love to hear your response to that, because clearly liberty and equality are ideals that figure strongly in your work and scholarship.
I didn't mean to be evasive about identity, but this is the notion of identity as belonging.
Right.
You see, what pre-modern societies, however terrible they were, and they certainly were terrible, right? Serfs, even slaves, however terribly they suffered, right? They didn't suffer from a lack of sense of belonging. They had all sorts of other, maybe worse, much worse, defects in those societies. So liberty and equality were introduced in the Enlightenment to correct those defects of pre-modern societies, right? But the way they were configured generated deep malaise of alienation, right? And so my thought was, we need a reconfiguration of the unalienatedness of pre-modernity, because it was unaccompanied by liberty and equality, right? And we need a reconfiguration of liberty and equality by nesting it within alienation. So you need a holistic, triangular reconfiguration of all three, so that unalienatedness today would not be the unalienatedness of pre-modernity, because it would be nesting within liberty and equality, which wasn't earlier. But liberty and equality would change as concepts. They wouldn't be in tension. They wouldn't be merely social engineering in the way they are pursued, if you nested them with identities in the sense of belonging. So I didn't mean to avoid your question about identity. It's actually very much part of what I mean by.
No, I fully understand. Cornel, you wanted to get in.
Oh, no, you go right ahead.
Please. I was going to tee it up for you.
I think both you and Brother Akeel are really getting at something that's very crucial here, because See, on the one hand, you talk about somebody like Karl Marx, you know, you're talking about somebody who has a Hegelian backdrop. And the Hegelian backdrop doesn't give a lot of weight to liberty or equality. It doesn't give a lot of weight to justice, just like in Marx. For Marx, the fundamental commitment is to freedom, it's Freiheit, and it's social freedom. And liberty, equality, justice is a marginal. Alan Wood and others made this point many, many, many years ago, right? Marx's critique of justice, Marx's critique of talk about liberty. And social freedom is very much about overcoming alienation. You know, it's a Sittlichkeit that does not have the atomistic effects that make it difficult for individuals to come together in some Gemeinschaft-like way. And so the challenge becomes, okay, well, what happens in the US context? Because see, as a Black person, the Black freedom movement's major backdrop is not Hegel. It's not Schiller's letters on aesthetic education or overcoming through various free play and so forth. It's a US context. And the US context is Lockean. I mean, Louis Hart's had a point, even though he took it too far. The liberal tradition is shot through the very bowels of American political culture, and Black folk pick it up too. So Frederick Douglass talks about liberty all the time. You're absolutely right, my dear sister. He talks about liberty all the time. Equality, oh my God, the Black freedom movement talked about all the time. But does that mean that somehow that one cannot still embrace conceptions of social freedom, of overcoming alienation coming out of Marxist backdrops that are informed by Hegelian preoccupations with overcoming alienation, which sit at the very center of the Hegelian project and sit at the very center of the Marxist project? Because Marx, in that sense, is as rich a footnote to Georg Hegel as you can get, given the larger backdrop. Yeah.
So what happens when we bring to this the social and moral lens that you referred to at the top and that you bring to your scholarship in activism? How should we conceptualize, or perhaps I should say, how should we reconceptualize the notion of identity as well as all of these other ideals and notions through that moral and spiritual lens that you were talking about?
Very briefly, because I want to hear Brother Akeel here, but I mean, we have to be jazz-like all the way down. What I mean by that is embracing the hybridity, even as you accent the moral content of that hybrid identity. And if you embrace the hybridity, it means that, following Jeff Stout and others, it's a kind of bricoleur orientation, that you're teasing out insights in a flexible and fluid way in order not to be frozen and dogmatic, but you're still moving forward. This is not the kind of crude instrumentalism of certain pragmatism, but it's simply phronesis. It's simply a practical wisdom that's deployed so that you don't get locked into one framework or one lens or one way of looking at it or one conception of how you proceed. You have to be open to a variety of different insights and ways in which you engage the world, the real, the political, the cultural, and so on. And a lot of times it's not even predictable. We're not talking about any kind of algorithm or any kind of formula here. This is phronesis in a very intense way.
Yeah.
You know, part of the trouble I feel is that, so I mean, I should declare my views. I'm not a liberal, and I'm actually opposed to liberalism. And I think part of the problem is that on the questions you've been putting to Cornel about the spiritual and the religious and its role in politics, you see, part of the trouble with liberalism is that it cannot cope with, it cannot really find a central place for commitment. I really think that is a very serious lack in liberal thought. And here's what I mean. I mean, you see, if you take Mill, if you look at Mill's argument for liberty, Mill's argument for liberty is we can always be wrong. Anytime we have any view, it could always be wrong. So we should tolerate dissent. Right? But when somebody has a deep commitment, they don't get anxious that they're wrong. They're just moved by the power of the belief. And that's a real clash. I'm talking about a temperament, a clash of temperament and moral psychology of politics, right? I mean, so that's why if you take Ulysses and the Sirens, right? So Ulysses said, I'm so deeply committed to whatever, Penelope, fidelity or whatever, to my family, that I know that I will, the Sirens will sing their songs and I will be seduced, right? So I want to tie myself to the mast so that even if I'm seduced, I can't do anything about it. Now, liberals would find that irrational, right? Rawls finds it, Rawls, great though he is, right? In so many ways, he finds it irrational. What he told the communitarians was, I'm sorry, you don't get it. Even if you imagine yourself behind the veil of ignorance to be a devout Muslim or a Christian, you should still choose free speech because one day you might not be a Christian or a, right? So just like Mill's fallibility, Rawls has revisability, right? You can always change your mind and you must take out an insurance policy for your future state of mind. That's what free speech is. Now, if you're a deeply committed person, you take the opposite view. You say, if I change my mind, I will be weakened, as Ulysses said. You know, I would be abandoning what is deepest about me if I change my mind. So there's something missing in so much Western political liberal theories that they can't deal with commitment in this very deep sense. And I think that's part of the problem why it can't deal with identities, because identities come, the best identities, I don't mean the bad identity version of identity, the best identities come from commitment. And so this is a clash of moral temperament that infects politics.
But Brother Akeel, are you saying though that fallibility cannot be integral to a strong identity? Is that what you're suggesting? No, it seems to me that fallibility ought to be one aspect of one's identity, just given the fallenness and finitude and fallibility that we have as creatures. I mean,
yeah,
I don't want to confuse that with just hypocrisy and cowardliness in liberalism. I mean, that's a different kind of thing. They don't want to be consistent when they apply it. Let's say John Stuart Mill to India, you know, the footnote in the great essay on liberty, right? Now that we know that's different. And that, and a left-wing Millian can deal with that.
Yeah, that's a very critique of empire. Yeah. So that's a very interesting and challenging question, Cornel. You see, my thought is not that identities are primordial or essentialist in that they can't change.
Right, that's right.
I think they can change. In fact, in the case of Ulysses, it does change, right? So let's say at time T1, he's deeply committed to fidelity, etc. Right? That his family, that's his commitment, his identity. At time Tn, when the Sirens sing their song, he's seduced, right? But at time T1, he was so deeply committed to it that he tied himself to the mast, right? Because he thought all changing would be a loss of self. It would be some other person. What is that? You know. So I don't mean to stress that identity is incapable of change. It's not primordial. There's one changes one's identity, but to have an identity based on deep commitments means you don't take the view, oh well, tomorrow I might be different, so I must, you know, take out an insurance policy in case I'm different, and that becomes prudence. That becomes, you know, a prudential conception of, you know, whereas that goes against making deep commitments now. You know, you're always thinking, being guided by it's almost like a Cartesian epistemology. I could be wrong. I could always change my mind, protect my future. You know, it's not that. That's what I'm objecting to.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Because I was just wondering what you do with John Dewey, for example. And of course, when you got to Sidney Morgan Besser chair, we love our dear brother Sidney. I used to break bread with that brother every other month when I was at the Union many decades ago. But I mean, there you got a certain kind of very progressive liberalism where fallibility is built in. But Dewey could take a stand. Brother Sidney could take a stand just as strong as any other person who's committed, it seems to me. And those examples, and they're still within a certain kind of liberal zone. I mean, Dewey is a kind of social democrat liberal, but he's a radical liberal in that way. The way the great Charles Mills was, we just lost Reese. He was a Black radical liberal in that way. But would you accept that with Dewey?
Well, what I'm anxious about is that fallibility shouldn't take the form of saying I should always come up with arrangements to live by such that should I change my mind, right? My current commitments can't be, my current commitments will just be over and done with. And right now I must hold my current commitments in such a way that I'm always aware of that happen. I'm not denying that it can happen. I'm just saying I can't have my present states of mind always infected by the thought that they might change. That's to give up on commitments, right? Because when you have a deep commitment, you feel it wouldn't be you. That's the link with identity. It wouldn't be you if you were to do that.
I think one of the underlying issues, maybe Cornel, you're getting at, is that what's happened in our present environment is that deep commitment has become, and authenticity has become conflated with inevitable conflict and opposition. And so maybe one of the underlying questions in this conversation is, how do we reconcile deep commitment and an expression of authenticity with also a conception of these particular identities that are not necessarily oppositional or closed in their shape and in their posture. But
I think this question, it actually leads very naturally to the next question we were going to pose. And I might actually even elaborate slightly. We've been exploring questions of spiritual principles and sort of impulses, attitudes in shaping our conception of identity, pre-modern and modern societies, secular and kind of more religiously or traditionally oriented. But I think now it's quite interesting to bring this theme to bear on the question of social transformation. And so, Akeel, as we've already been discussing, you've looked very closely at the movements of social transformation championed by Gandhi and also by Karl Marx, and you've identified certain connections between them. But you've also made some interesting arguments that in some ways Gandhi goes beyond Karl Marx. And part of the reason he's able to do that is because of what some might call his transcendental or his religious or his kind of more spiritual conceptions and principles and priorities and embeddedness in a certain tradition. And Cornel, obviously, you've been very well known for having argued for the enduring relevance of Black political theology to the reorientation of American life to modern society more broadly. So, I'm particularly eager to ask both of you, what are some of the distinctive contributions that a spiritual or transcendent or religious framework can make to the cause of social transformation? And inversely, what might be lost when one removes the spiritual dimension from, say, a Gandhian or Kingian style program of social change? And with the connection to what you were just mentioning, without trying to put words in your mouth, Akeel, I'm sort of reminded of what you could describe as the difference between a fallibility of fullness, which is you recognize the limits of your understanding or your grasp of these massive ideals of justice, of truth, of faiths, of mercy, of all these things. So there's a fallibility within that, but it's not one that's out of like a fundamental lack, whereas the kind of fallibility that you're criticizing from a liberal perspective is more, I might be completely wrong. There might be nothing. None of this may be worth pursuing. And there's a slightly different kind of tone to those two. One can lead more toward the kind of nihilistic framework, and the other is one that is always growing and learning, but still is firmly rooted in a way. So again, not without trying to put words in your mouth, I think it does bring us to this question of what does a transcendent or spiritual or religious framework add to our ability to navigate some of these issues of identity and social transformation? So Cornel, perhaps we can begin with you.
Oh, good God, I was gonna build on what Brother Akeel had to say. I was thinking about his brilliant essay on Gandhi, on science and technology, and the way in which when nature is desacralized and the disenchantment begins to set in that we associate with Weber more visibly, but early on, even with the Romantics, that Marx can't capture that. You see, when nature is evacuated of a certain kind of value or set of values, and to use Buber's language, then nature just becomes an it to manipulate, or in Heidegger's terms, it's just on reserve to be exploited, you see. That Marx just doesn't go that far. And I'm thoroughly convinced that Brother Akeel is right about that. And Akeel will correct me in terms if I get his argument wrong, but this is just touching on the skeleton of it. On the other hand, of course, Marx is going to go some places that Gandhi doesn't go. So, I mean, again, you got to be jazzed. Like, you want to see what particular terrain we're talking about. On the terrain of conceptions of nature, Gandhi is much more profound, especially in the face of ecological catastrophe that we're facing, given the corporate greed and given predatory capitalist orientations toward nature. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of, the complexities of industrial and late industrial societies and class conflict, then all the talk about, social pluralism in the world that Gandhi put forth is not going to be too helpful. You got to have some class analysis. You got to keep track of these professional managers who's running the state, running the Pentagon, in the universities, the neoliberal university, producing these professional managers on the way to Wall Street, tied to careerism and opportunism, and oftentimes the two indifferent toward the plight of the poor and working peoples and so forth. So that it's never, as you know, either or, Brother Ben, and you know this from your own wonderful work, but it's a matter of trying to look and see the lens to which Gandhi is viewing him. He's deeper on this issue. Marx's lens, he's much deeper on this issue. Now, neither one of them come to terms with caste or white supremacy. We need Ed Bedker. We need Malcolm X. We need Fannie Lou Hamer. You know what I mean? And the same would be true in terms of patriarchy. We must have Simone de Beauvoir. We must have Toni Morrison. So that all of these voices are so very important as not just a conversation, but as a constellation of ways of looking at the world. And that for me is what is crucial, that no theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing. That wonderful line that the great Henry James wrote to Robert Louis Stevenson in 1901. What is cheating us of seeing? Gandhi's going to provide deep lens on certain issues, but he's going to be blind on others. Yeah. Marx, same way. Adorno used to say the biggest splinter in one's own eye is the biggest magnifying glass. That's Adorno. He's right about that. He's talking about himself too. He has some serious blind spots. We want to talk about that with Jazz and others. So that for me, the spirit, when you talk about spirituality, you're talking about what is generated through the lens that you look at. And the last word I'll say about this is when it comes to morality and spirituality. You see, what I want to always resist is the notion that having the right social analysis and the most preferable ideology still produces people of integrity, honesty, and decency. I don't believe that at all. At all. You see, that I could hang out with Leninists who are fighting against imperialism and know that a whole host of them are gangsters, that if they were in position, they'd be dominating people. But they're still my comrades in a coalition because we're part of an anti-colonial struggle and we're trying to push out imperialists. And so the issues of morality and integrity and honesty and decency and generosity and gentleness and kindness and sweetness, they cannot be reduced to politics. That's why moral and spiritual lens, that's why Gandhi, that's why Martin King play an important role, you see. Marx was not big on ethical conceptions of integrity, honesty, decency, just like you don't go to him for conceptions of death. See, when his wife dies, when Jenny dies, what does he do? He goes to the Alps with her picture in his back. He can't deal with it. He's overcome with it. Well, death is part of life. You're going to have some conception of coping with death, Carl. It's not in his text. That's all right. Nobody can do everything. Nobody can do everything. But you just don't look to Karl Marx through that lens to deal with death, dread, despair, disappointment, and disease. It's just not there.
So Akeel, let's turn to you.
That's wonderful. That's yeah. So I couldn't do better than to add to those remarks about. Let me just say that for me, you see, I'm not a religious person, but I'm constantly tapping the insights and inspirations that I get from people who have been deeply religious. I mean, I don't think there were better people who've walked on this earth than the liberation theologians in Central America. I really have never come across anybody whom I've read about it with that much amazing commitment. And not just to religion, but to equality and to deep social compassion. And you know, we live in a world in which there is no electable government which is further left of the Pope. No electable government in the world today is further left of the Pope. This man sitting in the Vatican is about as left as any government, any political party that can be elected. And so for me, even though I'm not religious, it does seem to me that these deepest political ideals, around which others like liberty and equality should be configured, in a way, you can't understand the idea of being unalienated, the ideal of being unalienated, except as a kind of religious faith or hope. You see, let me put it this way. From John Locke to all the theorists of political economy that he's influenced, there's one driving outlook of modern political economy, which is that a certain kind of collective mentality is impossible because each person asks the question, what if I cooperated and others do not? Right? Any collective depends on cooperation. But the way modern political economy thinks is that each person is completely rational to ask, what if I cooperated and others didn't? That would be the worst for me. Now, I believe, and I believe Gandhi thought this, and in this sense, Gandhi has a more general grip on being unalienated than Marx, who was very much tied to labor issues and so on. Right? For Gandhi, being unalienated is to have a state of mind in which that question and anxiety never occurs to you. What if I cooperated and others did not? That never occurs to you. It's not that you think it's wrong to ask that. That anxiety doesn't compute. It doesn't occur to you. It makes no sense. Right? That's what it is to be unalienated. Now, that is a matter of faith. See, it's not, so I tell, in an essay of mine on Gandhi, I tell this anecdote that happened to me when I was 12 years old. I don't know if I've told you this, Cornel. When I was 12 years old, my father would take me for long walks. And one day we were walking on the beach in Bombay, near our house, and we came across a wallet with some rupees, some money sticking out of it. And my father said, Akeel, why should we not take that? And I was 12 years old. I said, I think we should take it. And he looked cross and he said, why should we take it? And I said, what I think, if we don't take it, somebody else will take it. So let's take it. And he then stopped looking cross, and he suddenly got this look of epiphany on his face. And he said, so I said, if we don't take it, somebody else will take it. And he said, if we don't take it, nobody else will take it. And, you know, I was 12 years old. I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. What is this man trying to But only much later, when I was thinking about Gandhi, and it's what Gandhi was saying, you know, the question should never occur to you. What if I cooperate and others did not? Right? He says, if you don't take it, nobody else will take it. Now, you can't see that as a prediction. If my father said that as a prediction, it would be naive optimism. But he wasn't looking at the world in a detached way and saying, I predict nobody else will. So I'm saying that if you interpret his expression, nobody else will. If we don't, nobody else will. If you interpret it as a prediction, it comes off as naive optimism. But so it's not a prediction, but rather it was said like, let's see the world this way.
Yes.
Right? And that, I'm saying, is a matter of faith. I mean, I think that comes from religious people. That doesn't come from detached, analytical, you know, understanding of society and so on and so forth. So in the end, the deepest political ideals are commitments. They are like religious vows almost, in a way. You know, they are in the end a matter of faith and hope. And so you have to shift the angle from detached study, from analysis and so on, to this other thing. And I think that's how Gandhi saw it. And that's not exactly how Marx saw it. So that's why Gandhi was really a religious person in politics.
You know, I'm thinking of Bernard Williams on personal integrity. You remember that old critique he had of J.J.C.
Yes.
Smart's utilitarianism, that little blue book?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
I think a secular Nietzschean humanist like Bernard Williams could have that sense of commitment to personal integrity and moral consistency that your wise father was talking about, without a religious backdrop at all.
That's right. Yeah.
Is that, you accept? I think in that sense, because I think personal integrity, you know, it's ideologically promiscuous. You know, it will lie with any tradition, just like being a gangster is ideologically promiscuous. You see, you can be leftist, center, rightist. You can be an Islamic gangster, Christian gangster, Jewish gangster. Baha'i might even have one or two gangsters too. I haven't met any, but my hunch is as human beings, they got to have. I know Dizzy Gillespie wasn't one, and Elaine Locke were not gangsters. They were Baha'i, towering black figures in my history. But it's just, it's shot through every tradition, secular, religious, and so on. You see. And if that's the case, then the question becomes, especially in a moment of such spiritual decay and moral decrepitude in which we're living, as the American empire itself begins to slowly disintegrate, lose its sense of how to move forward, the greed takes over, the hate escalates, and the inability of people to feel as if they can respond individually and collectively. So the trauma on the one hand and the political despair and paralysis on the other. In such a moment, the fundamental question becomes, how do you keep alive the best of the past and present? That's the crucial question. I mean, there's a wonderful line that T.S. Eliot has in his essay on F.H. Bradley, his dissertation on Bradley. And Eliot, full of, you know, deep literary and wise insight, but he's just right-wing brother who I keep a distance from politically. I'm fighting to the core politically. But he says, we're at a moment now in the wasteland-like character of Europe where one of the greatest achievements is just to keep alive the memory of what was once moral and spiritual excellence. Now, what he understands that to be is different than what I understand it to be, but his insight is profound. It really is. It's like the end of McIntyre's After Virtue.
Yes.
The barbarians have already taken over, right? And I think if that's the case, then the question is, as educators, as teachers, how do we exemplify, how do we keep alive the best so that our precious young folk can build on that best as we begin to fade away and make our way toward the worms?
Right. And I think this, what you just said, Cornel, and this whole exchange really points to our next question, which sort of makes more explicit some of the things that we've been discussing. You are both proponents of revolutionary or deeply transformative social change. In other words, of a fundamental reimagination of society and its relationships. More and more human beings of all colors and identities, I think, would agree with you that such a reimagination is long overdue and urgently needed. But unfortunately, as we also know very well, stirrings for change are frequently thwarted. On the one hand, they can become co-opted in various ways by the status quo, by the existing order, its underlying assumptions and commitments, its pervasive materialism and material incentives. On the other hand, we find an increasingly pervasive assumption that people and groups and entire identities in some cases cannot be redeemed or transformed out of their ignorance or hatred, or that we just simply can't properly transcend the socialization that we've inherited through, the very stubborn and vicious legacy of white supremacy. So the question is, how do we overcome these obstacles to transformative social change? Cornel, you've started to discuss this, and we can start with you. What is it that we're missing? What do we need to realize genuine and thoroughgoing social transformation? And what can we learn from the figures you've discussed and you discuss in your book, Black Prophetic Fire, such as Ella Baker and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X?
Well, in some ways, it goes back to that nihilistic threat that I talked about before, associated with Nietzsche or Turgenev's Father and Sons with Bazarov. If we look at the world through the lens of a call for fundamental transformation, I think that's what Adorno meant. It's from the vantage point of redemption that we philosophize. He knew it would never be actualized. He knew it would never be realized. It's the lens through which you view it. So it's a negative dialectic in that sense. The whole is always false, as he says, but you still need to totalize. That's Jameson too. I think Fred's right about that. He gets it from Lukács. He's right about that. But you also know that the whole is always already deferred and will forever be deferred. So in that sense, the kind of lack of alienation, we were talking about Brother Akeel, there's always going to be a certain form of alienation. There's certain inescapable realities of life, death, dogma, forms of domination. We don't know of any moment in the history of the species that hasn't been forms of death, forms of dogma, and forms of domination. That does not mean that unalienation as an ideal, a regulative ideal, a lens through which you view the world analytically, morally, and spiritually is not worth fighting for. And of course, the religious view is to make that leap. And it's not just an analytical leap, it's an existential leap to say, this is how I'm looking at the world. Now, in my own tradition, it is to look at the world through the lens of the cross. I mean, I was told that every Sunday at Shiloh Baptist Church, if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. Because the ways in which that unalienated ideal is going to be manifest in your witness, in your work, in your deeds, in your poems, in your essays, in your paintings, in your relationships, and so forth. But you know always already that it's never going to be realized. I mean, it's no accident that Hugo of St. Victor, the great 12th century monk that Zaid would invoke all the time, over and over again, right? That tender person loves a piece of the earth the strong person makes any piece of the earth their home, but the perfect one realizes this world is not your home at all. That's an echo of almost Adorno. Part of the morality at home is knowing you're still not at home. So there's an inescapable homelessness and exilic condition built into your yearning for home. There's nothing wrong with yearning for home. Nothing wrong at all. Why? Because it is manifest in certain way. We talk about the relation of Brother Akeel to his father. His relation to his father is different. His relation to me, I love him and he loves me. His father is home in a certain kind of way. But that doesn't mean there's not any kinds of alienation that can still be there, because human beings are human beings. So you learn how to wrestle with that tension, live in the midst of that tension. And so it is with any of our philosophizing, especially in such dim and grim times. So that you're not surprised by evil, you're not paralyzed by despair, you're always on fire.
Akeel, how do you follow that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you see, I agree with Cornel. In a way, what Cornel is pointing to is how contextual it is. You see, there are some contexts in which we are completely unalienated. Right? It would never occur to me to ask of my daughter, what if I did my bit at home and she didn't? It never occurs. I mean, there are many contexts in which we're totally unalienated. We just exactly take the attitude that my father's remark was suggesting and that I was suggesting, is where these things, thoughts, anxieties never occur to us. But there are many others, especially if you've taken an economics course or something like that, you know, especially if you're overeducated in Ivy League schools and so on, that we very often in other frames, especially where public policy is formulated and so on, we might very much take an alienated view. So I think this is what psychologists call a frame problem. In some frames, we are unalienated. In some frames, we are deeply alienated. We don't even know we are being inconsistent because these frames are insulated from each other. So I think part of what a humane politics should do is to try and remove the boundaries between the frames, make us see our inconsistencies, help us to use one as a critical resource to criticize the other, you know, the thinking of the other frame. And the trouble is that it's very hard to do it under capitalism. It's just a fact that the way that capitalism shapes our mentality, it's very hard to scale up the unalienated frames thinking. And you know, I think Frederick Jameson is absolutely right. The reason, I mean, he made this remark, which is a brilliant remark, which is, it's easier today to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. I think it's a fact. We do not even have the discourse by which to deeply understand and criticize capitalism. I mean, in the political sphere, you can have one or two professors who do it, you know. But I mean, in the political arena, I mean, you've worked with Sanders, you know how difficult it is.
Yeah.
So in the political arena, and I blame liberalism for this, I blame the DNC, that's liberalism. DNC is liberalism. They are in the end the deepest enemy, even deeper than these right-wing people, because they come with a moral high ground. They come off as being progressive. But what they basically do is erase from the public discourse any deep criticism of capital. And as a result, you get populisms. You get ordinary people just saying the whole game is rigged. So let's support the next person. If the whole zeitgeist is like this, you go for the person who goes some crazy alternative right-wing fascist zeitgeist, because there is nothing in the political arena, no discourse, which they can shape their thinking and scale up their unalienated thinking. It's just not there. We can't imagine the end of that.
And that what you talk about is so crucial because, you know, we're living in such an escalating neo-fascist moment. Yeah. And there's such contempt for professional managerial neoliberals, not just in politics, but across the culture as a whole. And if there's no alternative that people have, given the increasing massive social misery, then they will go neo-fascist, thinking they're doing something as an alternative to a decaying neoliberal order. And the neoliberal order makes it difficult for there to be a left project. And Bernie was just one example. That's why we spent so much time trying to broaden the discourse, the critiques of Wall Street and so forth, right? But if you don't have any alternative there, then it's going to swing the other way. And at that point, you know, we find ourselves disarmed, as it were, or we find ourselves, as we did with Biden, you end up supporting critically, you know, a Biden as part of an anti-fascist coalition. And yet, you know, he's tied to mass incarceration, invasion, and occupation of Iraq, never saw a war he didn't break dance for the most part. You say, hey, we still had to support him because Trumpites are out of control. But one last point about this, though, in terms of an alternative, that there are, I mean, what I love about the Hegelian and Marxist legacy of the German Enlightenment, and going back to the prophetic legacy of Athens, is that we want to try to unsettle and challenge and unhouse people to show that what they thought was not alienation really is alienation. Mm. See what I mean? Mm-hmm. So we have to be very practically wise in terms of how we discern the unalienation and the alienation, right? Because you got slaves on the plantation that think they at home. No, you got the wrong conception of home. You're just looking for a certain kind of narrow safety. And what you think is free food, but you being dominated, and you know your friend, your wife is being sold on the way to North Carolina. Same would be true for workers. Same would be true for women in patriarchal households. Oh, I'm at home. Well, it depends on what home is. Yes and no. So alienation is a positive thing in terms of trying to trigger folk to make certain moral and spiritual and political moves. But on the other hand, if it's all alienation, every moment, it's like Didi and Go-Go and Waiting for Godot, Brother Samuel Beckett. It was hard to connect, hard to communicate, hard to relate. Then the only alternative to despair is to sing about despair. Mm. So you get the Irish blues, Samuel Beckett. I'm a blues man too, so I appreciate Sam's song. I appreciate Sam's song. Don't get me wrong. It's the echo of Chekhov's Three Sisters, actually. But the Russian blues is a little deeper than the Irish blues in that case. But still, it's hard to talk about organizing, mobilizing under such conditions.
We don't have a lot of time left, and I want to squeeze in some of the questions and thoughts that have been coming in from the audience. We're being urged by some audience members to spend some time thinking about the notion of a global age that's part of the title of the speaker series, and in particular, the notion of our common humanity or the oneness of humankind, and how our recognition of it can help us confront these existential crises that we face as a humanity in our global home. So, you know, maybe one way to get into this is to say that last month in this series, we asked Craig Calhoun and David Palmer to talk about what makes or what constitutes our common humanity. And of course, to address that question, we have to wrestle with the answers that have been given to it in the past. These include, of course, the exclusionary and often deeply oppressive conceptions of humanity that we've inherited from a long history of imperialism and colonial racism. They also include the rather thin conceptions of our shared humanity that underpin many forms of Western liberalism and cosmopolitanism. So I want to put the question to you from your perspective, and with just a few minutes left, what constitutes the oneness of humanity? What constitutes our shared humanity from your perspective? And how does our recognition of that common humanity help transform our identities in such a way that we can confront and grapple and be adequate to all of these challenges of global interdependence that we confront as a humanity in a global age? Akeel?
Well, you know, I really think that there is, the term global has been so come to be owned by finance. Right? I mean, the very idea of the global as we understand it today has been determined by, shaped by changes that occurred pretty much around 1980, a little before, but the effects were felt in the 80s. And that was the financialization of capital, which brought people together in a very particular way, right? Through the flow of capital and goods, but not through what you're calling a common humanity, in fact, undermining the common humanity. And we've got to really seek, and I don't know, I mean, just let me give you one example. And I mean, it's a very complicated issue, this global stuff. Let me just give you one example of how the very idea of global, of going beyond the nation and so on and so forth, because of the terrible things that nationalism has done. But just let's take the example of Brexit. Not even Brexit. Take a working person in Nottingham or Liverpool or somewhere. If a working person were to ask, ever since the Second World War, where is anything good that has happened to me? On what site has it happened? And the only answer he or she would give is that it's happened on the side of the nation. Health, housing, education, old age pension, every worthwhile thing that happened to a working person happened, say, in Nottingham, ever since 1945, happened on the side of the nation. We don't even know what it would be to dispense welfare, what mechanism it would be at the side of a supranation like Europe or Eurozone or whatever, right? I mean, Britain has got its own currency, but opting to, forget about opting out of Europe, right? Why would one want to have been in Europe in the first place if one is a working person, where we don't even have any idea where anything at a supranational or global site would give us anything? We don't even know what mechanisms would dispense every worthwhile thing that's happened to him. Right? So the common humanity really is only visible to such a person from what he or she has experienced between 1945 and neoliberalism, which was a period of Keynesian social democratic constraints. Right? So I feel globalization has, in fact, in that sense, has undermined the humanity and common feelings of progressing together that was there before. Right? So we need to we can't just throw the word global around and say, well, okay, but we have no idea what a global humanity would be, given that the very idea of the global has been shaped so much by things that destroy our common humanity. So I would just want to rethink the terms global and so on much more carefully, given the way that they have been shaped in recent years.
Mm-hmm. No, that's powerful and brilliant, really. I mean, it's not a whole lot to add. I mean, I was sitting here thinking, though, about the magisterial work of Brother Malachi that we were talking about, who teaches there at Duke. with this reconception of the emergence of modern Europe through the lens of a resilient and counterinsurgent Jewish culture, including the rabbis. And the lens through which you do that is one in which any talk about universalism that goes back to Amos, all nations let justice roll like waters, right? Going back to Isaiah, going back to Jeremiah, Esther, and so forth, you see, rooted in a very rich and deep particularity, but gets deep enough to have solidarity with other people who are suffering. And that's not every Jewish voice, not any voice, but it's the prophetic strand within that resilient counter hegemonic attempt to keep universalism alive, but a universalism so grounded, a universalism so immersed in structures of feeling and structures of value and willingness to serve and cut against the grain and still loving your grandmama when she's wrong and embracing your father when he's lukewarm and so forth and so on. And all of this is in this text. No, but we should give his full name, Brother Ben.
Malachi.
You're referring to Malachi Hakan?
Yes. Is it Jacob and Esau? Was that the name of it?
Jacob and Esau, that's right.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Now, I just given one example, but the point is this, that given the ways in which globalized talk has been colonized by capital and high finance, which is part of what Brother Akeel is saying, he's absolutely right. That's the Thomas Friedmans and others, flatten the world. Okay, Tom, you think it's flat, people down there getting crushed. Going, so fine, New York Times can run it. We love Tom, but he's just wrong. He's wrong. He's not looking at the world through the vantage point of those that Brother Malachi and others looking at it, you see. The underside of, no matter how high they matriculate, still cast as other in certain kinds of ways. And in a certain sense, we're on the way to Noam Chomsky, but that's a whole nother lecture. Because Chomsky comes out of that same tradition in the secular mode. He wants an internationalism that is so grounded that he can be with the Kurds, he can be with the Iranians under a vicious regime, he can be with the landless peasants in Brazil, he can be with black folk in America, he could be with Jews in Russia still getting mistreated. You get to them, that kind of counterinsurgent internationalism from below. See, that's the kind of talk about internationalism that I would go with. And it cuts across religious and secular in that sense, or religious and non-religious. I mean, Brother Akeel has so problematized secularism and secularization and so forth, it's hard to use the word without a full-fledged lecture. But just the religious and other traditions that are out there. Absolutely.
Wow, no surprise at all. Cornel West, Akeel Bilgrami, what an illuminating and rich conversation. We didn't expect otherwise, but we are just so grateful that you were able to join us today.
Thank you both very much for joining.
We thank you all, both of you.
So before we close, we wanted to thank our sponsors again, the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and the Center on Modernity in Transition. And of course, thanks to all of you, the participants, for joining us. We hope you'll do it again Friday, February 25th at 3 p.m. Eastern, when we will have the great pleasure of welcoming Or Rosenboim and Ines Valdez to discuss identity and alternative visions of world order. So we look forward to seeing you then. Again, Cornel and Akeel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We thank both of you. Love you, Brother Akeel. Love you, man. You stay strong.
See you soon. I'm going to see you.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll see you in the class, Brother John T.
We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shay. So it was very nice of you to.
Thank you.
Great to see you again.
Wonderful to see you. Wonderful to see you.
And we thank both of you all. You all doing wonderful, wonderful work.
Yeah.
Wonderful.